Over to you,
Hey,
John.
thanks very much, Meg, and thanks very much to Catherine and Richard for their presentation. I'm going to go, as Meg said, I'm going to go on to a slightly different tangent to Meg and Richard, but ultimately we come back to some of the same issues, which is about who has the sort of last say on things. So we've talked a bit about the law, we've talked quite a lot about politics as a source of constraints, but what we saw, and we saw particularly in Jane's talk this morning, is in between there's a bit of a grey zone, these things we call standards, conventions, and about the bodies that usually ministers have set up to act as watchdogs on standards. And she pointed out that they work in varying ways and have different sets of powers. So what I thought I would do for my 5 minutes is just sort of give you some examples of how these work in practice. So you can think about whether you're happy with the way those work or whether you think they need some degree of strengthening. So I think Meg gave us a hint in the break that you talked quite a bit about that recent case with Owen Paterson, the former MP for North Shropshire. So let's just look and see what happened to Owen Paterson. And it's quite interesting about how these things play out. Owen Paterson was investigated by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, who's in charge of ensuring that MPs observe their code of conduct. Remember, they agree what's in that code of conduct. She was asked to look at his case about whether he'd been lobbying and been paid to do so, which you're not allowed to do. And she looked at it and said she thought he had breached the rules. His case then went to a committee, the Parliamentary Standards Committee, and that has, as Jane said, a bunch of lay people sitting alongside MPs. They looked at the Commissioner's report, agreed with her that he had breached the rules, and recommended the punishment, but they didn't have the final say. That was for MPs. But when that came to MPs, asking them, as in convention they usually do, to sign off the 30-day suspension they'd recommended for Owen Paterson, the government used its majority, so that political constraint that Richard was talking about, to make sure that that punishment didn't go through immediately. They will say they were dealing with a different issue, but that was the immediate effect of what the government did then. But ultimately, as those of you who read through to the end will know, Owen Paterson ended up resigning. Why did he resign? Not because Parliament had said he had to resign. Actually, Parliament at the time was letting him off that punishment immediately, but because he couldn't cope with the political backlash that had followed in Parliament and from the public, both about his actions, but also the way in which government had handled it. So do we take out of that the system was not very good because actually it couldn't enforce a punishment, or actually there's nothing to be worried about because ultimately politics achieved the result that an MP who'd been found in breach of the rules ended up reconsidering his position and left Parliament. Let's take another example, this time about how we make sure ministers behave properly in public office. Jane told you about the ministerial code, which the Prime Minister issues. Actually, the Prime Minister doesn't actually have to issue it, but Prime Ministers have in recent years always issued a ministerial code. Last year, the Prime Minister asked his advisor on ministerial interests to investigate allegations of bullying against the Home Secretary. Those of you who are employees will know that one of the things you're not supposed to do is bully other members of staff. The Prime Minister asked his advisor to investigate. He did a report. The Prime Minister eventually published that report, and we found that the advisor had said he did think that Priti Patel had breached the ministerial code. Normally, the convention is that in those circumstances, the minister who's broken the code would resign. But the Prime Minister said he actually didn't think that Priti Patel had done anything that warranted resignation. Instead, the advisor resigned because advice hadn't been taken. He thought his role had been undermined. The government decided it could tough it out. And if you watch the news this week, you'll notice that both the Prime Minister and Priti Patel were right in their judgment that they could tough it out. They're both still in office. So what about that case? Are we worried there that the sanction hasn't been gone through, or are we actually quite pleased that, you know, the Prime Minister got to say and got the final say on who was in his cabinet? That's one of the things Jane said, that ultimately it has to be the Prime Minister who decides who's in his cabinet. But remember, that's not an absolute rule. If instead of bullying, the charge against a minister had been one that had been through the criminal courts and they'd been subject to a prison sentence of over a year, they'd have automatically been chucked out of Parliament, and then they couldn't have held a ministerial job. So there are some occasions when the Prime Minister's discretion on who he appoints is limited. And let me give you finally a third example. It's also been in the news quite a lot recently. And that's about, not about how we make these, how we enforce standards, but who enforces them. We've talked quite a lot about all these public bodies. The people who run those are subject to a process called the public appointments process. And again, this is an area where we don't set it out in law. We have some guidance about the processes ministers are supposed to follow when they appoint people to run these bodies. That's supposed to guarantee the independence of the process. An independent panel assesses candidates, and they then tell ministers who they think can do the job, in the jargon, who is appointable. And the minister, and ultimately for the most important appointments, the Prime Minister can pick a candidate from that list of appointable candidates. But they can also actually appoint someone who applied that the panel thought was unappointable, as long as they're prepared to explain themselves to Parliament and the public. In some cases, there are processes where, for really important appointments, there's a pre-appointment hearing with a parliamentary committee. But there's only one case where ministers have put into law that the committee can turn down a candidate. Otherwise, even if the committee thinks they're absolute rubbish, ministers can still go ahead and appoint if they think they can manage the politics around it. And of course, it's up to ministers to decide whether to change the guidance or not. So one of the things you want to think about is it enough to rely on guidance? Should we put these codes onto a proper legal basis, give people legal powers, leave it to judges or to independent enforcement bodies to decide whether the rules have been broken and what the sanction should be? But remember, as Richard's pointed out to us, ultimately this all comes down to Parliament. So Parliament can make and it can unmake those rules that are put in place to regulate behaviour. So in the final analysis, the real sanction is not with judges, not even with the politicians themselves in some ways, but with the public. So the reason that we have many of these rules, guidance, these bodies in place is that they're a response to public outcry when there's been a scandal, when people think that politicians have gone too far and need to be reined in. So big question, can we do more to make sure that sanction works better and that voters pay attention to what is going on and the way our parliamentarians and others behave?